The assessment was supposed to take 9 days. I know that now the way you know the length of a storm after it's passed, by counting the wreckage. The time sitting in the small preparatory chamber aboard the Veth assessment vessel, Methodical Inquiry, I knew only that it had been scheduled for 9 days, that we were on day 2, and that something had gone quietly wrong sometime in the last 18 hours. Could feel it the way a corpsman feels a patient's temperature change before the monitor catches up. Not a number, not a reading, just a shift in the quality of the air. I want to be clear about who I was in that room. I was not the diplomat. I was not the trade negotiator or the political officer or the cultural liaison. My name is Petra Solano, and in the spring of the year we made first formal contact with the Veth. I held the rank of Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class in the United Earth Navy, and my job aboard that vessel was to keep 7 human beings alive, healthy, and legally compliant with the Veth biometric submission protocols. I was the medical officer, furthest thing from a decision maker. Nobody was going to ask me whether we wanted the treaty. And yet, the Veth are not what you picture when someone says alien assessors. The word assessor makes you think of bureaucrats, clipboard carriers, form fillers, pale things in offices. The Veth are nothing unlike that. They are tall and narrow-limbed, with a coloration that shifts through the blue-gray register depending on their metabolic state, and they move with the kind of unhurried precision that belongs to things that have been doing a particular task for a very long time. They evolved, or so we were briefed, as long-range endurance hunters on a world with 17-hour days and almost no cover. They tracked prey for days without stopping. They were patient in a way that had calcified, over the millennia, into something close to ceremony. Their assessment process was in many respects indistinguishable from hunting. They gathered data. They analyzed it with extraordinary rigor. They decided, on the basis of that data, whether the candidate species was worth their continued investment of time. Species that failed the assessment were not exterminated. The Veth had no interest in that. They were simply noted as non-viable partners and filed, and the Veth moved on. There were, the briefing documents told us, 412 species in their non-viable registry. Only 19 had ever made it through a full assessment to the treaty recommendation phase. We were trying to become the 20th. The assessment had 9 scheduled stages. Stage 1 was biometric intake, a full-body scan of every delegation member, cross-referenced against the biological submission packet we'd filed 60 days prior. It was, the Veth assessor Reth Valon had told Ambassador Cosley through the translation system, a formality. We already have your biological data. Simply confirm it is accurate. Inaccuracy in self-reported data is itself a data point. He had said that last part with what I would later learn to recognize as dry Veth humor, which is indistinguishable, till you know to look for it, from everything else they say. I'd gone through my own biometric scan on day 1, third in the queue, in the secondary scan bay off the main corridor. A room of white indirect light and equipment I could not name, operated by a Veth technician whose name, rendered in the translation system's approximation, came out as something like Velsoth. The scan took 4 minutes. I lay on a surface that was not quite a table, more like a slightly consooved floor that had been raised to waist height. And the equipment moved around me without touching me, and Velsoth observed with the composed attention of someone watching a process they have performed 10,000 times. It was painless. It was, if I'm being honest, one of the more comfortable medical procedures I've ever undergone. I went back to my duties. The next morning, day 2, Ambassador Cosley called a brief internal meeting before the scheduled Stage 2 session, which was supposed to be the cognitive assessment phase. He said only that the morning session had been postponed. Valon had communicated through official channels that the assessment timeline required internal recalibration. Stage 2 was rescheduled to the afternoon. This happened with the mild, apologetic language that all bureaucratic postponements use, and we accepted it with the mild, professionally cheerful language that all diplomatic delegations use. And nobody said out loud what it meant. I went to find Commander Yusuf Adain, our political officer who had more experience reading Veth communication patterns than anyone else on the delegation. I found him in the small observation lounge at the starboard side of the vessel, standing with his arms crossed, looking out at the gray-silver surface of neutral Station Herrick 4, through a window that was either very clean glass or a very convincing screen. "What's actually happening?" I asked him. He gave me a look that said he was deciding how much to share with a hospital corpsman second class. "We don't know yet," he said, which was the diplomatic way of saying he had an idea and didn't like it. The postponement is procedural. They do this sometimes when a preliminary review raises a flag that needs clarification before the substantive assessment can proceed. What kind of flag? Could be anything. Data discrepancy, cross-reference failure, a submission error in the original packet. He paused. Usually it resolves itself. The recalibration is either administrative or it isn't. And if it isn't, he looked back out the window, then we'll know soon enough. I went back to the medical bay, a small compartment we'd been allocated at the far end of the delegation's assigned quarters, and I sat with the biometric submission packet on my tablet and went through it the way I go through a chart before a procedure. Methodically, without assumption, looking for the thing that doesn't match. The packet was my document. I'd prepared it. 60 days of medical records, formatted to Vethkara specifications, for all 7 delegation members. Blood work, imaging, pulmonary function, cardiovascular data, metabolic baselines. I had spent 3 weeks on it. I had triple-checked it. I found nothing wrong. Afternoon came. Stage 2 was postponed again, this time to the following morning. Rethbulant's communication was brief and polite and told us nothing. Ambassador Cosley thanked him through the translation system and the channel closed. The 7 of us sat in our assigned common area and did not look at each other the way people don't look at each other when they're all thinking the same thing. That evening, I went to Velsoth. This was not, strictly speaking, in my remit. The chain of communication between our delegation and the Vethkaras ran through specific designated channels. Valan to Ambassador Cosley, primarily, with the political officers and cultural liaisons handling specific substreams. A hospital corpsman second class did not simply walk to the scan technician's workstation and start a conversation. But Velsoth had scanned me. My medical data had passed through that room. If there was a flag on one of the 7 biometric intake records, the scan technician was the most direct point of entry, and I was the delegation's medical officer, and I had decided often that the professional courtesy of a medical to technical inquiry was not outrageous. The Vethkaras assessment vessel had corridors that felt more like maintained laboratories than passageways. Clean, white, lit with the same indirect panel lighting as the scan bay. The walls composed of a surface that was slightly warm to the touch in a way that suggested active temperature regulation. I found Velsoth at a workstation in the secondary scan bay, reviewing something on a display that I couldn't read. The translation system I was wearing was a small device clipped behind my ear, and it worked on spoken language with a roughly 3-second processing lag for Vethkaras. "Corpsman Solano," Velsoth said. The translation carried the flat, neutral register that I'd come to understand was Vethkaras default. Not cold, not warm, simply precise. "You are not scheduled for a secondary assessment." "No," I said. "I'm here in a different capacity. I'm the delegation's medical officer, and I wanted to make a technical inquiry about the biometric intake records. If that's not appropriate through this channel, I'll route it through Ambassador Cosley." Velsoth regarded me for a moment. The shift in their coloration was subtle. A slight deepening at the edges, which I'd been told in briefing, indicated active consideration. "Technical inquiry is within your professional scope," they said. "What is your question?" "I want to know if one of the 7 intake records raised a flag that's contributing to the assessment recalibration." A pause. "That information falls within the assessment process documentation, which is not typically shared with delegation members during the active assessment period." "I understand," I said. "I'm not asking which record or what the determination was. I'm asking whether the recalibration is related to the biometric intake at all." That's a yes or no question. And if the answer is yes, I'd like the opportunity to provide supplementary medical context, which is explicitly permitted under Article 9 of the Assessment Protocol, agreement we both signed. I had in fact read Article 9 the previous night. It was dense and specific and, like most of the protocol agreement, written in the Vethkaras administrative style, which favored precision over brevity. Article 9 covered the provision of supplementary data during any assessment phase in which preliminary findings were inconsistent with submitted documentation. It required only that the delegation's designated medical officer make a formal request in writing through the assessment record system within 48 hours of the preliminary finding being logged. The preliminary finding I had calculated had almost certainly been logged during day one's biometric intake. I was inside the 48-hour window, but not comfortably. Velsoth was quiet for a moment that I counted without moving. Yes, they said. The recalibration is related to the biometric intake. Thank you, I said. Can you tell me which delegation member's record raised the flag? Another pause, slightly longer. The flag is on record 7. I was record 7. I was the last one through the scanner, because I had administered the other 6 delegation members' intake procedures and then gone through myself. Thank you, I said again, and I meant it. I'll file the Article 9 supplementary request through the assessment record system tonight. I left and went back to the medical bay and sat with my tablet for a long time before I opened the assessment record system. I want to say that I knew immediately what the flag was, but that would be tidier than the truth. The truth is that I went through my submission data again, systematically, and I didn't find it until I got to the cardiovascular baseline section and looked at the number I'd filed under resting heart rate, reassessment baseline, and then looked at it again. 42 beats per minute. I had measured it myself 3 times on 3 separate mornings, averaged the results, and filed it. It was accurate. It had been accurate for years, since the 2nd year of my marathon training, when my resting rate had dropped through the low 50s, and then the high 40s, and eventually settled where it settled. Sports medicine physician had noted it in my file with a single annotation: athlete adaptation, benign. My annual physicals had noted it the same way for 6 consecutive years. It was not a medical concern. It was not even, in the context of human medicine, unusual for a serious endurance athlete. I looked it up in the Vethkaras biological database, the public portion of which had been shared with the diplomatic corps as part of the assessment preparation materials. The Vethkaras resting heart rate for an adult at baseline, 68 to 92 beats per minute. The Vethkaras threshold below which cardiac function was classified as critically impaired, 55 beats per minute. The Vethkaras threshold below which a biological entity was classified as non-viable for sustained function without immediate medical intervention, 45 beats per minute. 42 was not below 45 by a comfortable margin. 42 was below 45 by 3 beats per minute, which in their database placed me in the same category as organisms in the final stages of cardiovascular failure. I sat with that for a moment. Then I laughed. Not loudly. It was late and the common area was just down the corridor, and I didn't want to explain it. But genuinely, from somewhere around my diaphragm, the kind of laugh that comes out when something is so specifically absurd that there's no other response available. The Vethkaras, meticulous, rigorous 340 years of species assessment under their belt, had looked at my heart rate, concluded I was dying, and begun quietly dismantling the most important diplomatic process in human history in order to spare themselves the awkwardness of explaining that the human delegation's medical officer had apparently arrived at the assessment in cardiac arrest. I filed the Article 9 supplementary request at 2200 hours. The request was straightforward. I identified myself as the delegation's medical officer and the subject of Record 7. I noted the discrepancy between the flagged metric and the biological submission packet, and I formally requested that the assessment record be supplemented with the following attached documents: my complete cardiovascular medical history for the preceding 6 years, including 6 annual physical examination reports, my sports medicine records for the same period, specifically the annotated cardiac baseline assessments, my most recent graded maximal exercise test, conducted 4 months prior, with full VO2 max data, heart rate, recovery curves, and the attending physician's interpretation, my endurance training log for the prior 12 months, including average weekly distance, average session intensity, and coach's notes, and a short explanatory note that I wrote myself in plain language, explaining what athletic bradycardia was, how it developed, what it indicated, and what it did not indicate. I kept the explanatory note brief and factual. I did not make it defensive. I did not apologize for having a low resting heart rate. I simply described the physiology, cited the relevant human medical literature, and noted that the submitted supporting documentations confirmed a 6-year stable baseline with no clinical significance. Then I went to sleep. I am good at sleeping before things. It's a skill I developed in training and refined through several deployments. You sleep when you can, you eat when you can, and you do not spend the night rehearsing scenarios that may or may not occur. I have talked to people who can't do this, and I understand that it's not a moral failing, just a different relationship with anticipatory anxiety. My relationship with anticipatory anxiety is apparently to file my paperwork and then put my head down. I slept well. In the morning, there was a message from Reth Vallon in the official communication channel, addressed to Ambassador Cosley, noting that the Article 9 supplementary request had been received and was under review, and that the Stage 2 session would be delayed pending the outcome of that review. The ambassador called me into his office, a term I use loosely since it was a compartment not much larger than a generous closet, and looked at me with the expression of a man who had spent 20 years in diplomatic service and had learned to read bad news in advance. "Record 7 is you," he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at the message again, then at me. "What did they flag?" "My resting heart rate, 42 beats per minute." I watched him process this. In their classification system, anything below 45 indicates imminent cardiovascular failure. I filed a supplementary request under Article 9 last night. I've attached 6 years of supporting medical documentation. Ambassador Cosley was quiet for a long moment. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, who had represented Earth in 11 separate diplomatic contexts, and once famously talked a breath van trade delegation out of walking away from a 15-year commercial agreement by spending 4 hours eating a traditional breath van meal that he later described as like breathing heated sand, slower. He was not easily rattled. "You're not actually in cardiac failure," he said. "No, sir. I ran 12 miles 3 days before we boarded the transport." A pause. "How fast?" 8 minutes a mile. I wasn't racing." He looked at me with something that might have been in a different context, amusement. "And you think the Article 9 request will resolve this?" "I think the supplementary data is sufficient, yes. Their own assessment protocol requires them to review supplementary documentation before making final determination. Once they see the VO2 max data and the training logs and 6 years of stable baselines, their algorithm should reclassify." "Should." "Will," I said. "The algorithm is deterministic. It doesn't have opinions. It follows the data." He was quiet again. I understood what he was weighing. The treaty, obviously, but also the question of whether to go around me, whether to have Reth Vallon approached at a higher level, whether to push politically rather than procedurally. I watched him decide not to. The Veth Karas responded to procedure. Going around the process was exactly what you did not do with a species that had built its entire civilization around the integrity of its own assessment methodology. "Keep me informed," he said. "Yes, sir." I went back to the medical bay. I checked on the other delegation members. All healthy, no issues. The minor complaint of Dr. Annette Vogler about a headache easily managed. And I organized my workstation and went through the previous day's documentation and in general behaved like a person who was not currently the single point of failure in a 9-day diplomatic process that had been building for 4 years. The review took 11 hours. I knew it was happening because the assessment record system showed the status of my Article 9 request as under active review from approximately 0630 through to 1740, which point it changed to review complete, addendum pending. I noted that without reacting to it, finished the note I was writing on delegation health status, and went to dinner in the common area. At 18:15, a formal message arrived in the official communication channel from Reth Vallon, addressed to Ambassador Cosley, notifying the delegation that the Article 9 review was complete, and requesting that Corpsman Solano attend a supplementary assessment briefing the following morning. I spent the rest of the evening doing what I always do before anything significant, reviewing my documentation, making sure I hadn't missed anything, and then going to bed. The supplementary briefing room was on the 4th level of the assessment vessel, a level I hadn't been to before. The 4th level was, from what I could tell, where the Vethkaras themselves worked. Not the public-facing assessment spaces, but the actual analytical infrastructure. The room I was brought to was larger than the scan bay, though not by much, and it had the same indirect white panel lighting and the same slightly warm walls. There was a table, a genuine table, flat, at a height suited to both human and Vethkara standing, and on one side of it stood Vel Soth and 2 other Vethkaras whose names the translation system rendered as Korith Ban and Sevelmin. Reth Valen was there as well, standing slightly apart from the others, with the slightly elevated posture that I had come to associate with a Vethkaras who was playing a senior role. On the table was a display, a flat, horizontal panel that could be read from either side, and on it was my cardiovascular file. All of it. The 6 physical examination reports, sports medicine records, the graded exercise test, the training logs, laid out, I assumed, in some organizational logic that made sense to Vethkaras assessors, which meant it was almost certainly organized by data type and chronological order and some statistical summary I couldn't read from where I stood. Cormson Solano, Rethvalen said. Thank you for attending. Thank you for the meeting, I said through the translation system. We have completed our review of the supplementary materials submitted under
Call 9.
Rethvalen paused. The coloration shift at the edges was present, the same thing I'd seen in Selsoth the evening I'd come to inquire. Active consideration. We have some questions, of course. Korith Ban, who I would later come to understand, was the delegation's senior cardiac systems analyst. The Vethkaras apparently had specialists for exactly this kind of cross-species physiological assessment, moved closer to the display and touched it in a way that brought up the graded exercise test results. VO2 max readout was prominent. This test was conducted 4 months before the assessment began, they said. The indicated maximum oxygen uptake is 71 milliliters per kilogram per minute. That's correct, I said. A pause. The Vethkaras range for elite endurance function is between 42 and 58. Our biological database contains records for 217 assessed species. The highest recorded value across all of those species is 64.3. I said nothing. Your value is 71, Korith Ban said. Yes. This was confirmed by the attending physicians and the testing equipment calibration record, both of which are included in the submission. Yes. Another pause. Korith Ban looked at Rethvalen in a way that I couldn't read precisely but that gave the impression of a silent exchange. Then, Korith Ban looked back at me. We also reviewed the cardiac baseline trend data for the preceding 6 years. The resting rate of 42 beats per minute has been consistently documented since year 3 of the series. Since I got serious about the training, I said. My rate was in the low 50s before that. Sevel Min, who had been quiet until now, spoke. The low 50s was already below our non-viable threshold. I know, I said. I was in good health then too. There was a pause that felt, even through the translation delay, like the kind of pause that happens when several beings in a room are recalibrating something. Rethvalen spoke. The Article 9 review has determined that the preliminary flag on Record 7 was the result of an incomplete data context. The submitted supplementary materials provide sufficient basis for a revised determination. A pause. We will require one additional data point. Vel Soth, who had been standing back throughout this, moved slightly forward. A direct demonstration. A graded exercise protocol, conducted here on the vessel. We have the necessary equipment. The protocol would take approximately 40 minutes and would measure your cardiovascular response to graduated physical load. We would observe the data in real time. I looked at them for a moment. You want to watch me run? A slight pause. We want to observe the kick function you are describing in active operation, Vel Soth said. Rather than inferring it from documentation, I considered this. It was, from their perspective, entirely reasonable. They were assessors. They assessed directly when they could. They had documentation suggesting that the organism they had flagged as dying was, in fact, operating at the highest cardiovascular efficiency ever recorded in their assessment history. Of course they wanted to see it. When? I asked. This afternoon, Rethvalen said, if you are willing. Give me an hour to eat and warm up, I said. I sent a message to Ambassador Cosley summarizing the meeting. His reply came back in 4 minutes. Understood. Do what you need to do. Which was, Ambassador Cosley, practically effusive. The Veth Karas exercise assessment bay was on the second level, and it was the most impressive room on the vessel. Not the largest. The main assessment hall was larger, but the most precisely equipped. The treadmill equivalent that Velsoth showed me to was a surface that adjusted angle and resistance continuously based on a parameter set. They entered before I stepped onto it, and the monitoring equipment around it was extensive. Cardiac, pulmonary, gas exchange, motion analysis, blood pressure, a non-invasive continuous blood draw system that sampled through the skin without puncture. 4 Veth Karas were present, including Korath Ban and Velsoth, and all 4 of them had the focused, attentive quality of beings who expected to see something they hadn't seen before. I stepped onto the surface in my exercise clothes, the ones I'd packed, because 6 weeks on a diplomatic vessel still meant I needed to maintain my training, and did 5 minutes of dynamic warm-up while the equipment ran its calibration cycle. Leg swings, hip circles, a slow high knee walk across the room and back, my arms loose. Velsoth tracked the warm-up data as it registered, which meant that my heart rate during hip circles, 61 beats per minute, was also now part of the Veth Karas assessment record. I thought briefly about explaining that hip circles were not a meaningful diagnostic, then decided against it. They could contextualize it themselves. Velsoth talked me through the protocol. 8 stages, each 3 minutes, each increasing the load. Starting easy, ending at what they estimated was maximum tolerated exertion based on my documented baseline. Protocol had been calibrated that morning, using the submission data. He explained. The angle and resistance at each stage were set to produce approximately the same relative intensity increments as the graded exercise test I'd done 4 months prior. They wanted comparable data, not merely data. That, I thought, was a real thing about the Veth Karas. They didn't just want to see a number. They wanted to see a number they could compare to a number they already had. The rigor ran all the way down. What's your estimated maximum tolerated load? I asked. Korath Ban consulted the display. Based on your submitted documentation, we anticipate peak cardiovascular function at stage 6. We will proceed to stage 8 in any case. We expect stage 6 to represent your functional ceiling. All right, I said. I started the protocol. Stage 1 was easy. It would be easy for almost anyone with legs. The resistance and angle were set for a warm-up pace, and my heart rate climbed from 41 to 53 beats per minute over the 3 minutes, which I could see on the display. Velsoth had angled so I could read it. 4 Veth Karas watched the numbers the way I imagine a radiologist watches a scan, quietly, with complete attention. Stage 2 pushed the load. My rate climbed to 69, stage 3 to 88. The Veth Karas were still quiet. At stage 3, my breathing had shifted from conversational to controlled, the steady rhythmic pattern of someone in a sustainable aerobic state, and I could see, from the corner of my eye, that Korath Ban had leaned slightly toward the display. Velsoth had moved to the secondary monitor and appeared to be pulling up the comparative chart they'd mentioned in the morning briefing. The historical database of assessed species. I watched them find it. I watched them look at the column that showed the prior record of 64.3. Then I stopped watching and put my attention back on my form, because losing form on a treadmill, equivalent because you're watching aliens, at a chart, is the kind of thing my coach would have had opinions about. Stage 4, 108 beats per minute. VO2 uptake reading, visible on the panel, was climbing through the mid-40s. Stage 5, 126, sustained. My breathing was deep and even. I was working but not at any kind of limit. Had done longer runs than this, at higher intensity in the rain, at 0500 on base, and thought nothing of it. 2-mile training runs in August heat. I'd run 3 marathons and 1 ultramarathon, and competed in a military endurance event that, 68 kilometers over 3 days with full kit. The stage 5 load was not to the ceiling for me. It was barely a hill. Stage 6. This was the stage Korthban had predicted would be my ceiling. My rate settled at 141 beats per minute. The VO2 reading was at 63. My breathing was harder now, not labored, but deliberate. I was aware of my form, of the slight forward lean that my coach had drilled into me, of the arm carriage that I kept low and compact. I was aware that 4 alien assessors were watching data appear on a screen that was presumably telling them something they had not expected. Velsoth moved to a secondary display. I could see them zooming in on something, the VO2 uptake curve, I thought, and then pulling up what looked like a comparative chart. Stage 7. My rate reached 157. The VO2 reading crossed 68. I was now in the territory where the effort was genuinely uncomfortable. The sustained high aerobic state that training teaches you to inhabit without panic. The place where untrained humans tend to back off because everything feels urgent. I did not back off. I had been in this place for thousands of hours. I knew it the way a sailor knows rough water. Not pleasant, not frightening, just the work. Stage 8. The load jumped. The surface angle increased and the resistance came up, and my rate hit 169 beats per minute in 45 seconds and kept climbing. 171, 173. The VO2 reading was at 70 and still moving. My lungs were working at their full capacity, which is a sensation that is hard to describe to someone who hasn't pushed there. Not suffocation, not pain, just the clean total engagement of the respiratory system, every air sac open, every breath earning something. 175 beats per minute. VO2 71.2. I held that for 90 seconds. The protocol ended. The surface slowed to a walk. My rate began to drop immediately. 162 in the first 30 seconds, 151 a minute later. And the recovery curve, which was apparently another thing Korthban was watching closely, was steep, which in human sports medicine means excellent cardiovascular recovery function, which is itself a marker of exactly the kind of adaptive efficiency that produces a 42-beat resting rate. I walked for 3 minutes, cooling down, my breathing smoothing out. 4 minutes post-peak I was at 120. 6 minutes, 98. 8 minutes, 74. The room was very quiet. I stepped off the surface. I was sweating, which is another thing that the Vethkuras had apparently documented carefully. I'd been told in the briefing materials that they found thermoregulation through perspiration both biologically fascinating and slightly alarming in practice, and I had packed absorbent toweling specifically to manage this. I dried my face and forearms and stood in the center of the room and looked at Korthban and Velsoth. Neither of them said anything immediately, which I had come to understand was not rudeness but the Vethkuras equivalent of needing a moment. Korthban was studying 3 displays at once: the primary cardiac readout, the VO2 curve that had been running throughout the protocol, and the comparative chart they'd had up since stage 3. The curve on the primary display was still declining. My heart rate walking itself back toward baseline the way it always does after a hard effort, reliable as a tide. The room had the quality of a space in which several beings were thinking the same thing and were waiting to see who would say it. Korthban said, "Your resting rate post-exercise." I waited. I had a sense of what was coming. At the 8-minute mark, I'd been at 74. By 10 minutes, in good conditions, I usually got back to the mid-60s. By 12 or 13, I was often in the low 50s. I know my own recovery. I've watched it hundreds of times. We waited 11 minutes and 40 seconds by the display clock before Korthban spoke again. "Your current cardiac rate," they said, "is 43 beats per minute." "That's about right," I said. "Give it another few minutes." We waited 4 more minutes. The final reading, which Velsoth recorded into the assessment log with a formality that I found, in retrospect, genuinely touching. The same careful precision they'd applied to flagging me as dying, now applied to documenting that I was operating in a physiological category that apparently had no prior entry in their database, was 41 beats per minute. 1 below my submitted baseline, because the exercise had done what exercise does to a trained cardiovascular system. It had prompted the adaptive response, the brief post-exercise recovery dip, the temporary enhancement of cardiac efficiency that gives you numbers slightly better than your resting average. 41 beats per minute. I had arrived at this assessment in the Veth Karas assessment database as the most critically impaired delegation member they had processed in recent memory. I was leaving that exercise bay, having just demonstrated a VO2 max of 71.2 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and a resting rate that was, per their own data, lower than any organism they had ever assessed had achieved while remaining alive and ambulatory, as something they had apparently not previously categorized. Reth Valen observed the second half of the exercise protocol from the doorway without my noticing, spoke from behind me. Corpman Solano, I turned. They were standing with the composed stillness that I'd learned was Veth Karas concentration at its highest pitch. Not the edge-deepening color of active calculation, but a different quality, stiller that I'd seen only once before, when Reth Valen had received a communication that required senior assessment council approval before responding. The stillness of something that has arrived at a conclusion it was not prepared for. Your supplementary documentation has been reviewed and accepted, Valen said. The preliminary flag flaw on Record 7 has been reclassified. The assessment recalibration is resolved. Stage 2 of the full assessment will proceed at 0900 tomorrow. Thank you, I said. Rethvalen was quiet for a moment. Then, the exercise data will be logged in the assessment record as a supplementary cardiac function demonstration. Korithban will annotate it with the appropriate classification. Understood, I said. There is no classification in our current framework, Valen said, that adequately captures this data point. I looked at them. The translation system was a 3-second lag, and I sometimes wondered, in moments like that, what was being lost or gained in those 3 seconds, what the original words were carrying that the system either preserved or didn't. What classification will you use? I asked. Ban has proposed a provisional notation, Rethvalen said. For record purposes. Kurthban consulted their display and read, since the flat Veth Karas administrative cadence that I'd come to understand was their version of formality. Assessment Supplementary Note, Word 7, Cardiac Function Demonstration. Organism exhibits sustained peak aerobic function in excess of all prior assessment records, with resting cardiovascular baseline inconsistent with existing non-viable parameters. Recommended reclassification. Parameters insufficient for current framework. Assessment flag. Withdrawn. Parameter insufficient for current framework, I repeated. It is the accurate notation, Velsoth said, and I thought, though I was never certain, that there was something in the delivery that I would have quiet satisfaction from a human. We went back to the assessment, all 9 stages. Stage 2 the next morning, Stage 3 in the afternoon, Stages 4 and 5 on day 4. The Veth Karas were thorough in the way that a species which has been assessing potential partners for 340 years is thorough, which is to say completely, systematically, and without hurry. They tested the delegation's cognitive response patterns, their cultural adaptive flexibility, their collective decision-making under constrained conditions, their ability to communicate across a partial translation gap. They tested Ambassador Cosley's patience, which was, I can tell you from observation, nearly inexhaustible. They tested Dr. Fogler's specialist knowledge in xenobiology, which was comprehensive enough that several men spent an entire afternoon in discussion with her, that the translation system struggled to keep pace with. They tested me once more. Not a physical assessment, a clinical one. On day 7, Ban came to the medical bay with Velsoth and asked if I would walk them through my management of the delegation's health records, protocols for on-site emergency care, my decision tree for triage, under field conditions with limited supplies. I did. It took 2 hours. Ban asked questions that suggested they had read the entirety of my submitted documentation and wanted to understand not just what the records said, but what the reasoning behind them was, how I made decisions in the space between protocols. At one point, Korith Ban asked me to describe a situation in which I had been required to improvise outside my training, and I told them about a field deployment 3 years prior in which a colleague had presented with symptoms consistent with 2 different diagnoses, and I'd had equipment to confirm one but not both, and I'd made a call on the evidence available, and it had been the right call, and I walked through the reasoning in real time. Velsoth recorded it. Korth Bands asked 2 follow-up questions that were so specific about my confidence threshold for acting on incomplete data and how I distinguished between a situation that required immediate action and one that required waiting for more information, that I found myself thinking harder about my own process than I had in years. I answered as clearly as I could. I did not oversell anything. I explained the limitations of my equipment, the gaps in my training for exotic biological emergencies, the things I did not know. I also explained what I did know, which was considerable, because I had been doing this job for 8 years, and had worked in conditions that were not optimal, and had learned to solve problems with what was available. Korth Ban made notes throughout. At the end they thanked me with the flat Vethkaras formality that I had stopped reading as coldness, somewhere around day 4. It was precision. They were precise about gratitude the same way they were precise about cardiac data. On the afternoon of day 9, Reth Valen called the full delegation to the main assessment hall and presented the Stage 9 findings for the formal assessment outcome. The hall was the largest room on the vessel, high-ceilinged, with windows along one full wall looking out at Herrick 4, and the same consistent white panel daylight that lit every room, and a long central table at which both delegations sat facing each other for the first time in the 9 days. There was something in that arrangement, human delegation on one side, Vethkaras assessors on the other, everyone in their best, translation systems on, the windows showing Herrick 4's silver-gray surface below, that had the weight of a photograph you'll look at. Ambassador Cosley had straightened his jacket twice before we sat down. Dr. Vogler had her hair pinned back with the particular care she applied to formal occasions. I had my uniform in order and my hands folded on the table and tried to look like someone who had not been, 5 days prior, the sole reason the entire exercise almost ended. Reth Valen read the assessment findings in the formal Vethkaras register, which the translation system handled with the slight added latency it used for official documents. The findings covered in order: cognitive profile, cultural adaptation index, communication compatibility rating, decision-making framework assessment, specialist knowledge distribution, collective resilience modeling. Each section was read in full and logged into the records simultaneously, and each section's concluding numerical rating was announced and then posted to a display that both delegations could read. The Vethkaras did not editorialize, they did not build to a reveal, they presented data. We scored well on cognitive profile, very well on cultural adaptation, which I attributed in large part to a Dane who had spent 6 specifically studying the Vethkaras communication patterns and had apparently been doing this to exactly the right degree. Specialist knowledge distribution was our highest-rated section, which was Dr. Vogler's doing. Her afternoon of technical discussion with Sival Min had registered apparently as one of the stronger specialist knowledge demonstrations in recent assessments. And then, last, the biological viability assessment. I sat very still. The biological viability assessment, Reth Valen said, 6 delegation members at baseline confirmed status within existing assessment parameters. A pause. 7. Delegation Medical Officer Corman Solano has been logged separately under the provisional classification established following the Article 9 review. Ambassador Cosley glanced at me. I kept my face still. The provisional classification is parameters insufficient for current framework. Another pause. In 342 years of assessment practice, this notation has been applied twice. The first instance was recorded in year 61 of the assessment program, when the delegation from the Karaneth Bound returned after a preliminary assessment with documentation demonstrating that their resting metabolic rate, initially flagged as indicating terminal organ failure, was in fact the baseline of a species whose organs operate at a fraction of the energy expenditure of any previously assessed biology. That assessment resulted in a treaty recommendation. The Karaneth Bound have been treaty partners for 268 years. The room was very quiet. The second instance is recorded today, Valen said. The biological data submitted for Corman Solano and subsequently verified by direct demonstration indicates cardiovascular function, that is, in the assessment program's data, without precedent. This notation does not indicate failure of assessment. It indicates the protocol framework that the assessed organism has exceeded the boundaries of the current framework and requires an expanded baseline for accurate future evaluation. He paused again. The coloration shift was visible around all four Vethkaras in the room. The deep edge consideration: shade, extended, sustained. The total assessment outcome for the human delegation is as follows, Reth Valen said. Overall viability index, 78.4, which exceeds the treaty recommendation threshold of 65 by 13.4 points. Of the 19 prior species to receive treaty recommendations in the history of the assessment program, the average viability index was 71.2. Another pause. The human delegation's overall index, 78.4, represents third highest assessment outcome in program history. Ambassador Cosley was a man who had spent 20 years managing his face in front of alien delegations. He managed it now, but I was sitting 3 seats down from him, and I knew him well enough by day 9 to see the quality of the stillness. Not the controlled stillness of professional neutrality, the weightier stillness of a man absorbing something larger than he'd let himself expect. The Veth-Karas assessment program recommends treaty engagement with humanity, Reth Valen said. We will transmit the formal recommendation to the Assessment Council within 48 hours. You will receive the treaty draft proposal within 30 days. The formal portion ended there. There was a recess, and during the recess, Ambassador Cosley found me near the window wall, where I was looking out at the gray-silver flat of Harrick 4 and thinking about the run I was going to do when we got back on transport. Because 9 days of minimal physical activity was a long time, and my legs had opinions about it. Solano, he said. Sir, he was quiet for a moment. Outside, 4's surface was lit by an indirect, diffuse sunlight that came through the station's translucent roof panels, and it had the quality of late morning light on an overcast day, pale and even and without shadows. Third highest in program history, he said. Yes, sir. And the third highest was us, not because of anything I did, or Vogler did, or the political team did. He paused. It was us because you have a very slow heart. It's a fast heart, I said. It just doesn't need to work as hard. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. Is there a difference? Medically, yes, I said. A very important one. He shook his head slowly. I'm going to have to explain to the Secretary General that the treaty was nearly derailed because our medical officer's heart rate was too low and was ultimately saved because she asked to see her own file. You can also mention that I provided 6 years of supporting documentation and passed an exercise protocol, I said. I will, he said, and there was something in his voice that was warm and dry at the same time. Register of a man who has found the absurdity and made peace with it. I absolutely will. I received, 2 days after we returned to the transport, a copy of the assessment record entry from Korath Ban. Not the full record. Just the supplementary note for Record 7, which they sent through the official communication channel with a brief formal explaining that it was standard Veth-Karas practice to provide assessed delegates with a copy of their personal entry upon the conclusion of a successful assessment. I still have it. I have kept it in the same folder as my annual physical reports and my sports medicine records, which seemed like the right place for it. The entry is exactly what Korath Ban read aloud in the exercise bay, with one addition at the bottom. A final annotation, logged by Korath Ban on the day the assessment concluded, in the Veth-Karas administrative cadence that I had spent 9 days learning to read. It says, post-assessment addendum, the cardiac function data for this delegate was initially processed within the parameter framework applicable to all previously assessed species. That framework proved insufficient. The delegate did not adapt her biology to fit the framework. The framework was extended to fit her biology. This is noted for the benefit of future assessors. The expected range of human cardiac function should be revised to account for the observed upper boundary. The lower boundary, 41 beats per minute, confirmed in active recovery, is logged as the new baseline for delegates of this species, PORT, intensive endurance training. Assessors. Encountering a resting cardiac rate in this range for a physically conditioned human should not, under any circumstances, initiate assessment discontinuation They should instead pull the full medical record. The data is almost certainly more interesting than the flag. I read that last line in my bunk on the transport home, somewhere between Herrick 4 and the first relay point, and I laughed again. The same kind of laugh as when I'd first seen the 42 on my submission form, deep and genuine, and slightly longer than the occasion probably warranted. The data is almost certainly more interesting than the flag. 342 years of alien medical assessment, 217 species. And that was the annotation they wrote. I've thought about it a lot since then, because of what it says about me. The number is just a number. A product of 8 years of early mornings and long roads in the particular kind. Stubbornness that makes a person keep going when their legs are arguing otherwise. It says something about the process, about the gap between a metric and the context that makes a metric meaningful. The Vethkaris understood that gap. They'd built an entire protocol for bridging it. Article 9, the supplementary review, the direct demonstration. They could have dismissed the flag without investigation, or held to the initial determination and ended the assessment. They did neither. They looked at what the data said, and when supplementary data suggested the first reading was incomplete, they looked at that too, and they kept looking until the picture was accurate. You would think that's a simple thing. It turns out it's not. It turns out a lot of processes and a lot of species find it quite hard to let the framework be wrong and the organism be right. The Vethkaris found it straightforward. 342 years of practice, probably. We signed the treaty 6 weeks later. I was not in the room. Treaty signings are for ambassadors and senior political staff, not hospital corpsmen, and appropriately so. I was in the medical center on the diplomatic station, giving Dr. Vogler's new research assistant a booster shot she'd neglected before departure. Then, I went for a long run in the station's internal track facility, 6 miles at an easy pace, my heart rate sitting calm and steady in the low 90s the whole way. 41 at rest, into the 90s when I asked it to move, back down to 41 before I'd finished the cool-down walk. The Vethkaris called it parameters insufficient for current framework. Sports medicine physician calls it athlete adaptation, benign. I just call it what it is, the same heart I had before any of this, doing what it's always done. It never needed adjusting, it just needed someone to read the whole chart.